It's the Sam and Sandy Show, starring Sam Landau with assistant Sandy Fuller. Hey!
If I start singing, it might be all week, so I'm not going to do that.
So
Welcome.
you're looking at the treasure of Remembrance the Holocaust. I am the founder and president of this wonderful thing that we have here at the library. We're so grateful to Dana Sanchez, the staff of the library. Let's give them a round of applause. And the fact that we have this 6-month extension. If you haven't seen the exhibit, it will be open. But most important thing is my buddy is here, Bonnie Harris. Bonnie is just one of the most incredible people in the world. So smart, so great. And just so you know, we have the brochures in the back. If you can let your synagogues know, your temples know that we're here on Tuesdays. We have tours that we give, but we give tours on the other days. But we are here no matter what on Tuesdays from 12 until 2:30. And next month we will have a Guri Stark. Tell us about Guri a little bit.
He's basically an artist, and he's going to be talking about art from the Holocaust. He has a lot of pictures, a lot of work that was done, especially even with survivors while they were captured as well. So
Drawing what they saw.
it'd be very interesting,
Very
from young
interesting.
kids to adults.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And after that in April, we got to tell you this now, that in April there will be Ben Midler, a Holocaust survivor who will be speaking, who survived 6 camps. So we're going to let you know that now, because you're probably going to start lining up in March for that.
Is that the second?
The second Tuesday of every month. The second Tuesday of every month. All right, Bonnie, without further ado, I'm so happy to see you. I'm so happy. This is Bonnie Harris.
Good evening. I'm so happy to be here. I can talk about this and forever, and my kids will say, "Don't get her started." You know, you'll never turn her off. But we're going to start with a film tonight. It's a 16-minute film. When I completed my dissertation in 2009, which was the first academic study of the rescue of refugee Jews in the Philippines, I was then contacted in 2010 by a Philippine-American documentary filmmaker, Sonny Izon. And we started collaborating on the film that he was producing. And we were taking versions of it all over the world to spread the story at different film festivals and many different kinds of events at synagogues and at yeshivas, and we presented to Tel Aviv University. We were in South Africa. We were in Bali. We were everywhere. And in 2020, we were invited to present a version of the film. This 16-minute version was presented at the United Nations on the Holocaust International Remembrance Day of January 27th, 2020. And so, without further ado, I'd like to start us off with that 16-minute film.
A half hour outside Tel Aviv, in the town of Rishon LeZion, stands a monument so unique it is unlike any other in the world. It is the only Philippine monument on Israeli soil, celebrating the friendship between Filipinos and Jews and commemorating the rescue of over 1,300 Jews by the Filipino people in the late 1930s. It is called Open Doors. The triangular patterns of the doors echo the triangles in the Philippine flag and the Star of David. Their white color represents the hope and warm hospitality that these Jews fleeing from Hitler encountered in the Philippines. The brown color of the door frames is symbolic of the Filipino people. And finally, the 3 sets of footsteps are 3 generations of Jews who who are alive today because of one nation's act of courage and compassion.
I really did not want to leave. That was my home. That was all that I knew.
When we had no place to go, the one place that did open its doors were the Philippine Islands and the Philippine government. What we didn't know was the degree to which the Filipinos would also open their hearts.
I still maintain a Filipino passport today, and I insist that my children carry a Filipino passport as well, out of respect for where they came from.
We were all grateful that it existed. We were grateful that somebody like President Quezon was open at a time when the only other place in the whole world where I think Jews were still accepted was Shanghai.
From the time after liberation to the time that I left, I took the jitneys, I took the buses, I took taxi cabs. I knew every street, every corner. It was my home. And it always will be.
On November 9th and 10th, 1938, as a retaliation for the assassination of Ernst von Rath, a series of coordinated attacks by roving bands of Nazi brown shirts with generous support from local citizenry destroys hundreds of Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes throughout Germany and Austria.
All businesses were shattered, glass was shattered, the temple was shattered, people came in screaming, mobs were breaking the glass all over the city. It was not only in Germany, it was also in Austria, it was in Vienna, and that was the true writing on the wall.
The brown shirts came into the building, so they went to the super of the apartment building where we lived. And they said, are there any Jews in there? And my father, as a doctor, had treated the wife of the super free without charging anything because they were very poor people. And at that moment, his kindness, so to speak, received an enormous reward because the super and his wife said, no, there are no Jews living here.
Nearly 100 Jews are killed and 30,000 arrested and sent to concentration camps. It would become known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass.
A new law came out that German Aryans were not to go to Jewish physicians or not be treated by Jewish physicians anymore.
And then my father realized that the time is up and he should better start looking around for another country to take him.
My parents planned carefully what clothes we would need for the Philippine Islands and so forth. We took a train from Breslau to Marseille, and then in Marseille we took a boat.
When we boarded the ship, it was a bit exciting for me. It was sort of an adventure, and I felt somewhat secure. I had my brother there, I had my parents there. I know I was going to a new country, but it was somewhat exciting.
On November 15, 1935, exactly 2 months after the enactment of the Nuremberg Laws, the Philippines becomes a Commonwealth of the United States and elects Manuel L. Quezon as its first president. The U.S. sends Paul V. McNutt as U.S. High Commissioner to the Philippines. In time, the two would become the best of friends and important allies in the rescue of Holocaust Jews.
My father was a person who couldn't bear to see injustice in any form. And of course, Hitler and the Holocaust were the limit of injustice. So, my father was happy to make room for the to come to the Philippines.
President Quezon valued human life. It didn't matter to him that the Jews were not Christians. Religion was not an issue to him. It was just posed before him as a problem by international events. And he believed that he had to contribute to its resolution. And he said that the people of the Philippines, when that time came, would be glad to have opened the door to those who were threatened in Europe. He offered the country as a sanctuary for refugees. It was just the right thing to do as far as he was concerned. It was just the mere humanity of it and his feeling for empathy for a persecuted people.
I was very impressed because we rode up Dewey Boulevard into Pasay, and it's a lovely beach, lovely beaches, beautiful banana trees, and there were the polo grounds, I remember.
I always was very slim, and I learned a lot. And my best friends were Filipino. But once you start, you forget. You know, you just go with the flow.
There was a great deal of sharing. It is in the nature of the Philippine that if a girl or someone wore something that you liked, more than likely she would offer to give it to you, which is a very much part of the Philippine culture.
As we were sleeping in the middle of the night, the house was shaking as if there was an earthquake. Everybody woke up. So we ran outside and stood in the street while the houses were shaking. But there were these large booms, booms, booms. Turned out that we were being bombarded by the Japanese.
We had daily air raids. They were awful. It was groups of 4, 4, and 4, which you could barely see, exceedingly well trained. And of course they bombed at random, and it was a very frightening experience.
With Manila completely devastated, the refugees began leaving for America, Israel, and Europe. Although the Philippines was a temporary refuge, for many, it will always be home.
And still, till now, I love rice. Yeah. I love rice. Yeah. My friend says, how can you eat that rice? I said, well, you want to hear a story?
It's when you've come from a place where you have been degraded and humiliated in so many ways, that the contrast was that you came not only to an open, but you came to open hearts.
I was there from the time I was 7. I was there for almost 9 years. And that was my home.
It's funny, because whenever I go back, and I go back every once in a while, the plane starts to land, and there's the Pasig, and right now I'm starting to cry. I do that. I tear up. I say I'm home. It's home.
My whole outlook on life was formed by that, those experiences. And in brief, it's just a matter of taking things as they come, not really worrying too much about things.
For me, the Philippines, it may not be my motherland, but my adopted motherland, because if it had not been for it, I would not be the person that I am now.
He had a heart as big as a house. He loved everybody. And he was very demonstrative about it.
This is an important story because it shows that there were people that cared and people that were trying to do some good in a world that was really going crazy.
My father was very outspoken. Whatever he felt, he would say, pretty much. So, since he was that way, Mom, Dad, and I would have just been on a train east. Maybe a bar of soap would be sitting here. Don't know.
He actually had a vision for himself, for his children, for his country, the place of that country in the world. And left nothing to chance to ensure that it was.
It's a story of kindness to other people, helping out when people are in trouble. That's what people should do, what people do all the time.
The story is important because it symbolizes the triumph of compassion and hope over hate and prejudice at a time when anti-Semitism ran rampant in the Western world.
If it would not have been for the Philippines, I would not be here today. That's why, and me growing up among them, I feel like I'm one of them.
This was his Holocaust story of these people far away who I didn't know, who saved him, and that he carried with him in his heart his whole life and gave him great pleasure and happiness. This was a Holocaust story I'd never heard.
Roosevelt and Churchill saved Western civilization. But Quezon, and so few people know that, President Quezon of the Philippines saved 1,200 Jewish souls, as many as Schindler, maybe even more. And that is the epitome, basically, of Judaism. It says if you save one soul, you save mankind.
And so let me talk to you. There's so many avenues that I can talk about, but I certainly want to talk about how I came to this story, Cantor Sisner's story. I was finishing my master's degree at San Diego State University in about 2002. I'd been working for the archives for a couple of years. I'd met Sylvia Sisner. in the archives. She was would help volunteer, and I was the archivist for the Jewish Historical Society of San Diego. And she only mentioned her husband in a couple of times, and I had no idea that I was spending time in the company of a Holocaust survivor and who had been married to a Holocaust survivor. And when Sylvia needed to relocate from San Diego to Santa Monica to be closer to her daughter, Charlotte, she was closing up her house, and in her house was her husband's office. Her husband, Cantor Sisner, had died quite suddenly on Purim of 1960. And she had 3 little girls. Charlotte, the oldest, was 10, and her sisters were younger. And she closed up her husband's office and left it untouched for 40 years. And then as she was moving, the curators of the archives asked her if they could gather his papers for the archives and his music and everything that he had in that office. And as the archivist for the archives, his boxes of papers came to me, and it was my job to take chaos and to give it order. Oh, which I loved doing. And then it is when I was going through his papers and I'm sorting them out and I'm dividing them up, and I'm seeing that he was in these various places in Germany, Hanover and Hildesheim, and he was a cantor in Hamburg, and then his papers were coming from Sobonchin in Poland in 1938. And then in May of 1939, his papers are in the Philippines. And I'm going, how did he get from Poland to the Philippines? And in amongst those papers was a copy of the telegram that had come from Manila, and actually it had been sent to Hamburg, where he was last known by this Rabbi Schwartz, who they had been compatriots and workers together in Hanover and Hildesheim. And by this time, Rabbi Schwartz was in the Philippines, and he wrote to him and said, would you like to come to Manila? Modest salary, side jobs provided, wire Manila today, send response, heartfelt greetings. And the really efficient Nazi bureaucracy forwarded that telegram onto him in Sobonchin, Poland, where he was interned. That's a history that I don't have time to go into, but just to say that in October of 1938, there had been a thing called a Polonaktion, which Hitler was deporting all the Polish Jews of Germany, about 20,000 of them, to the border. And because Cantor Sisner's parents, his mother was from Poland, his father was from Czechoslovakia, he was considered Polish Jew, and he was deported, and he was then interned at this town, Suboncin, in Poland. So the telegram found him, he responded, and in May 1939, he was able to leave Suboncin, go back to Germany, settle his papers, and board a ship in Italy and sailed to the Philippines. How does something like this happen? For one thing, how did Rabbi Schwartz end up there? Well, we kind of have to go back in the story to 1937. It was in August of 1937 when we are going to have invasion by Japan of China. This is actually the start of World War II for Japan. Another Sino-Japanese altercation. And in that process, it now brings China under Japanese domination. And there had been an unfettered immigration of Jews to Shanghai. Shanghai was an international city of China that did not worry about visas or passports. Anybody could get off of a ship in Shanghai. And so there was about 17,000 to 20,000 Jews that had been jumping ships in Shanghai. As the opportunity to go west was decreasing, and they were finding opportunities to go anywhere. And remember, it's not yet World War II in Europe. You don't have occupation in France, occupation in Belgium. You have, even in 1937, not yet the Anschluss of Austria or the Sudetenland. But Jews had been marginalized, persecuted. Nuremberg laws of 1935 had denied them citizenship, had denied them rights. And many Jews, ever since the Nazi Party had come into power in 1933, were finding ways to leave. It was just hard to find somebody who would take them, because you couldn't just leave without a visa of somewhere where you were going to go and they were going to let you in. And Shanghai was one of those places. Well, when the Japanese then invaded China, you then had Shanghai now under the auspices of the ally of Germany. And that made the Jews of Shanghai very anxious and very afraid of what was going to happen to them in that now city under Japanese domination. And so the Germans, Nazi Germany, sent one of its ocean liners, the Gneisenau, to Shanghai to remove German nationals from that city, so to get them out of the war zone, yes? And amongst those Germans that they brought were about 30 to 40 German Jewish families who, it was like rock in a hard place. Do we stay here, not knowing what's going to happen? Do we get on this Nazi ocean liner headed back to Europe? Right? And so the German ambassador there at the time had very good forward thinking and contacted Paul McNutt in the Philippines. He was the U.S. High Commissioner, kind of the counterpart to President Quezon, that they were coming. Manila was one of the ports of call. that this ship, when it left Shanghai, had to make these different stops before it goes back through the Indian Ocean and, you know, up through the Suez Canal and up into the Mediterranean. And so he asked if the Jewish community of Manila would take the German Jewish refugees off of their ship and care for them, because they were not wanted back in Germany, obviously. And so that happens. And those 30 or 40 families, maybe about 100 souls, off that ship that were Jewish, were then rescued and allowed to stay in Manila. Well, that starts a lot of communication, where you had all of these American Jewish organizations. You've probably heard of them: the Jewish Joint, your Jewish Distribution Company, the REC. You had different Jewish agencies all over the world that were looking for places where Jews could immigrate and be accepted and welcomed, and how can we get them visas and this kind of thing. And as word started to spread, word starts to spread through Europe that the Philippines have taken in Jewish refugees. And by December of 1937, you now have a very important communication between these two brothers, the Weiss brothers. One of them worked for the Refugee Economic Corporation in New York City, which was an agency looking for places for Jews to settle. And the other brother had been in the state government with Paul V. McNutt when he was governor of Illinois. And so the REC said to these brothers, can you contact McNutt in the Philippines and see if they can take in more Jews? This was in December of 1937. And his response was, and this is all in archives, I've been to all of them. I've been to all the National Archives, I've been to Paul McNutt's archive, I've been to Kazon's archive, and there's a letter there in Paul McNutt's archive where he responded to his Weiss brother comrade, hey, you know, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. next month. Let's get together and talk about it. And so McNutt makes this epic, he'd been now a high commissioner in the Philippines since 1936, is now 37. And if you don't know, if you think about your politics of what's going on with the Democrat Party in the United States, you know that in 1937, Roosevelt's already in his second term as president, yes? There's going to be a 1940 election. And if Roosevelt follows tradition, he will not run. And so Paul McNutt was being kind of schmoozed by members of the Democratic Party to look at doing a presidential run. So he comes back to the United States early in 1938 to meet with the president as High Commissioner of the Philippines. They would have had all kinds of meetings, and I have the minutes of those meetings and when they were. And he met with the Weiss brother, and they talked about rescue of more refugee Jews in the Philippines. And from that meeting that they had, and then these meetings that he had with FDR, and then a response back to the Weiss brother of the REC, that it's all set, I'll be able to approve visas. When I get back to the Philippines, we will get this organized and get it set up. Now, I got to tell you, that is something that made me want to look more closely at other events that happened in a worldwide situation, because you have something called the Avion Conference. Something that in March of 1938, after McNutt was flying home on the big clipper back to the Philippines, already had his meetings with FDR. In March of 1938, FDR had made some announcements, had said, we're going to see what we can do about organizing Jewish immigration worldwide, and called for an international conference. You know, timing is everything, right? And I know he had already met with McNutt, and I know McNutt had to have talked to him about his intentions. He's High Commissioner, Philippines, is the representative of the president in the Philippines. He can't do much of anything without the approval there, yes? And so McNutt makes it, comes back, they organize, he meets with Quezon. Quezon's all on board for this. They meet with what's called the Jewish Refugee Committee in Manila. This was a committee of American, very affluent American Jewish businessmen who had manufacturing sites in Manila. And they had organized a relief committee when that Shanghai issue came up, and they had raised money to help the Shanghai Jews. And so they were the ones that had received those refugees from that German ship and took care of them and fed them and got them jobs and got them working. And so McNutt went to this JRC and asked them if they would compose and organize a program to bring refugee Jews from the Greater German Reich to the Philippines. But the directive from Quezon was that they could not become a public charge. So there needed to be means for their support, funds for their support until they could be employable, until they could work, and until they could make their own way in the Philippine economy. This Avion conference that I had mentioned, when that met, World Conference, you had representatives coming from all parts of the Western world, no representatives from the Philippines, because the Philippines was a Commonwealth territory of the United States, represented by the United States. And probably I would have to call it, and I did call it in my book, one of the greatest diplomatic failures in world history. They met together, all of these diplomats of the world, and there was like 200 journalists there recording all this, was to talk about the German, Austrian, Sudetenland refugee problem of these stateless Jews. Where could they go? Can we organize immigration plans for them and have places to go? And not one of the countries at that Avion conference changed their laws. It would have been, even the United States didn't do it. You know, the world had gone through a depression. Countries didn't want to be overrun with refugees that were going to put financial burdens on their countries. They created new immigration laws. They created visa quotas and things of this nature to specifically to halt Jewish refugees from coming into their countries in any great numbers. And so the only thing that really came out of the Avion conference was a little committee who was tasked to find places where resettlements could take place. But not one country there changed its laws, changed its immigration quotas, or offered even an adaptation of their laws for political asylum. But by July of 1938, the Philippines had already composed their rescue plan, had made a list of professions that could easily take in refugee professionals, German professionals, and had presented that plan to Quezon and to McNutt. It had approval. It then was, they sought for funding from the JDC and the REC, and funding was granted. And they had already sent these lists of these professions to the Deutsche Hilfsverein for Jews in Germany, the Jewish organization in Germany. And these were already being circulated before the Avion Conference ever met. The Philippines had already started their rescue plan. And it's noteworthy that this list, as it went out, and you can see how they were, one rabbi not over 40 years of age, conservative, married, and able to speak English. Well, before this list of professions here in May of 1938, a couple of months before Avion Conference, Rabbi Schwartz and his wife had already jumped ship in Manila on their way to Shanghai. And there were a lot of Jews that were doing that. They jumping ports wherever these ships, sometimes they'd jump port in Singapore, because that was a British port. Manila was an American port. But Rabbi Schwartz was there, and he becomes the rabbi, and he was friend and comrade of Joseph Sisner. And that's how he got to the Philippines. And so you have then another turn of events. So when the list went out, what happened was that German Jews then would fill out these like applications, and they'd have to supply background information on themselves, what their profession was, and create this kind of like whole portfolio. This then would be sent to the REC in New York. All of those applications were then forwarded through communications via the War Department between the United States and Philippines to McNutt. And it would go to the REC board in Manila. And funding was then being promoted and being provided by the JDC and the REC, tens of thousands of dollars at a time, so that they could support the professional, the man or the woman and the whole family for about 3 months before they could then get themselves working and get their profession going in Manila. We had the first refugees start showing up around October, I think September and October of 1938, at the same time that Sisner is being deported from Germany to Poland. Now, the reason why that story of Poland is so important, because that happens October of 1938, October 28th of 1938. Okay? 1 week later, you have Kristallnacht. I think most of you know what Kristallnacht was. It was talked about in the film. Because a German youth by the name of Herschel Grünspan had gotten a telegram from his family that they had been deported to Poland. A family that Cantor Sissener knew. He knew the Grünspan family from Hanover. And Herschel was at school in France. And he got this telegram that his family's, their house, everything has been lost. They've been deported to Poland. And in his distraught condition, he went to the German consul there in Paris and shot and killed the German consular officer there, Ernest von Rath, which then Hitler used as a means to instigate a greater Reich violence against the Jews of the German Reich. You had destructions of synagogues, you had hundreds of Jewish men interned in concentration camps. And Cantor Sissener, who was in Zabanch in Poland, when they received the news, he knew that there was going to be no going back to Germany for them. And then it'll be about 6 months later that the telegram will find him in Poland. Now, something else happens during this time. Something that is so miraculous. It's rare. It was the only thing of its kind in all of this history. By this time, by December of 1938, the world saw what was happening in the violence with the Kristallnacht, and there were a lot of now people in the world, throughout Europe, that were trying to go into American consul offices to get permission to go to the Philippines. And they didn't know what to do. And so letters started to come from different consular officers to the State Department asking if they can issue visas to the Philippines. And the miraculous response, and trust me, I've got piles of documents this high from the National Archives. The response was, no, let me contact Paul McNutt, the High Commissioner, and find out. Well, they'd already had rescue, they already had Jews coming. They were coming off of ships from every month. Every month they had more and more coming into the Philippines. And so the response was from McNutt to the State Department, no, you can't have consular offices abroad issue visas. That has to go through the JRC here in Manila. And because President Quezon there was a lot of corruption that had been going on in his immigration department with Chinese nationals wanting to get land in Manila, in the Philippines. And so he had to kind of disband his whole, he had to disband his whole immigration department and put it under his offices. And so he took that board of the JRC, of those American Jews, and empowered them to be his immigration board for the country. And so That answer went back to the State Department. No, they need to send their request to this board of that has been empowered by President Quezon to be the immigration board for the country. And they said, okay. Because the State Department did not have power over Paul V. McNutt in this. He was the High Commissioner of the Philippines. He had that power. And so when the JRC would compile their lists and go through all of these applications, and they would make their lists, okay, is that the one I want? Yeah, that was the one I wanted. Okay. And they'd make their lists, then they would be approved by President Quezon. They would make this was the money that was in hand for these refugees. They'd have a list of names and addresses, and then they would be given from Quezon to McNutt. McNutt would then telegram them to the State Department with the instructions that you will contact the American consul at these locations and tell them to get in touch with these people in their jurisdiction and have them come in for a visa. That was rare, because at this time American consuls usually had the power to say yay or nay to a Jewish refugee coming to get a visa. And they had to follow strict immigration criteria and visa quotas, but there was no visa quota for the Philippines. And so they then would issue these visas and these priceless pieces of transportation papers that these Jews could then leave and make their way to Manila. And this transpired every month. This fashion went on all the way through 1939 until war happens, invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939, World War II in Europe breaks out, and it becomes incredibly more difficult for Jews now to get out of Europe. Almost impossible. But we still have Jews coming to Manila. By 1940, by about the middle of 1940, they changed this selection program into what we call a sponsorship program, where now if someone can put up the funds through like an escrow account with the Philippine JRC to supply enough money to support them in the Philippines for a year, then they can get a visa, because it was much harder now to get jobs, to be able to put them into employment. And so the sponsorship program then went into effect. And that was so inspirational, you might say, that the JDC used it as a pattern to set up similar sponsorship programs in other places of the world. As a result of that Avion conference, and you had that little committee that was formed that was looking for sites of resettlement for Jewish refugees in the world, there was about 50 different sites in the world where they found perhaps an opportunity for resettlement. One of them was offered up by President Quezon, the island of Mindanao, which he had been already building infrastructure in to resettle Filipinos from the island of Luzon, which was now becoming overcrowded, to the bigger island of Mindanao, which had all kinds of room. And he had been building roads, putting in infrastructure, and he offered the island of Mindanao as a site for mass resettlement. And his first generous offer was to say, we could settle 1 million there without a problem. And the American State Department had a fit. You can't do that. You can't settle 1 million white urban Europeans into an Asian jungle. You're going to have a problem. And then we're going to be responsible for it. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. But it went under review, and they organized a commission that went to the Philippines and thoroughly studied out this mass resettlement plan. And it went through some hiccups, and it went through some delays by State Department anti-Semitic people, and it actually went through some delays by some Kazon political enemies that didn't want Kazon to be favored in any of this. But the permission did come through. They were actually going to issue 10,000 visas to refugees for mass resettlement, to begin the mass resettlement in Mindanao. But then December 8th, 1941 happened. And whereas Pearl Harbor may have been bombed, so too was the Philippines. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into the story of what happens to the refugees now. There are 1,300 of them that make it. There were 10,000 that were ready to come but couldn't because of the war breaking out. But the one thing that I can say is that you're going to have a complete change of fortune. As the Japanese come into the Philippines and occupy the country, they will in turn the American Jews, the British Jews, the French Jews, the Polish Jews, of which Cantor Sissener was one. Because why? They're enemies. And so they intern all of the enemy, alien, non-military people into camps. Santo Tomas University was created one of the bigger internment camps for the civilians, enemy civilians. But the Jewish German refugees, if you had a passport from Germany or from Austria, then you were considered an ally of the Japanese, and they didn't bother you. They didn't care that you were Jewish. You had a passport that was German, we're allies with Germany, you're fine. And so you had this complete reversal of fortune where now the German refugee Jews, of which there were now 1,300, were now helping out their benefactors who were interned. And Cantor Sissener, who was interned, he had brought his mother over to the Philippines just before war broke out in Europe. But she had a German passport. He had a Polish passport. So he was able to petition and receive temporary status to where he could live outside the camp, but he had to wear a red armband that signified that he was an internee who was living outside the camp. And so for sake of time and to give us time for Q&A, I will say that everyone under Japanese occupation lived a horrific experience. Whether you were interned in the camps, there was about 3 of them, or if you lived outside of the camps. Starvation, deprivation, cruelty by the Japanese. They were very cruel to the Filipinos. There were occasions where atrocities were committed, and when then Manila was freed by the Americans returning three years later, it will be a devastating liberation. Manila will be the most destroyed city. That's his Cantor Cisner's band that he had to wear. The only city that fared worse in World War II than Manila was Warsaw. And 100 of the German Jewish refugees will die in that liberation of the Philippines. And then with the destruction of Manila and the destruction of the Philippines, there wasn't anything left there for them to do. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them will leave the Philippines and make their way to America or to Israel. As Israel, you know, will then be given its statehood in 1948. Cantor Cisner will come to San Francisco, 1947. He will bring his pen pal, Sylvia. That's a great story. I need to have an evening just to talk to you about their story. And she will come from London, where she had escaped to and saved her family. And they will marry and then come down to San Diego, where in 1951, where he will serve as cantor of Tifereth Israel for 10 years before his untimely death. But this story how one small Asian nation managed to do what so many more capable nations of the world were reluctant to do, and that was save Jewish lives. And as we saw in the film, it wasn't just that they were offered shelter or offered a haven or a place of rescue. They were given a home. They were offered citizenship. They were given friendship and love. And it was their home. And that was a rare, rare thing to have happened during these years. And that has created a special bond between the Philippines and Israel. In fact, it was the Philippines that cast the deciding vote in the UN that then gave enough votes for Israel to be granted its statehood. Philippines were the ones that put it over that mark. And so, what do we learn from this story? The Filipino people were poor, but they've got a big heart. And if you know Filipinos, you know that they are the most kind and compassionate and loving people. And it doesn't take position, it doesn't take money, it doesn't take power to do the right thing. It just takes a resolve to do the right thing. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm really happy to take any questions. I know I kind of flew through this really fast. Yes?
None of any of the people who came to the Philippines stay in the Philippines?
Yes, they did. You know, there is a new ethnicity of Jews, and that's the Filipino Jews, because you had intermarriage, and whereas most of them left, there were a few that stayed. And then in the post-World War II age of the Philippines, it was a time to rebuild it. And you had businesses coming back. And you had America helping the Philippines to recover. And you had American military men who came there, stayed. American Jewish military men came and stayed. And you now had a Sephardic Jewish community in the post-World War II years establish itself and build a new synagogue, which is in Makati. And you have a lot of men then who had come with businesses, with military, who ended up marrying Filipino wives, had Filipino-American children, and raised them Jewish. So you've got quite a vibrant community there. Yes?
About how many Jews really were saved other than the 1,200?
The exact number was like, through this rescue operation, was like 1,306. There would have been more had the war not broken out. There was mass resettlement slated for Mindanao. There was always the problem that there were more applications than they had funding to be able to support. And there was a family of American businessmen called the Frieders, the Frieder brothers. They had a tobacco manufacturing there in Manila. And one of them, there was 4 brothers, and one always rotated in every 2 years. And lived there and ran the manufacturing there. And then they'd move out and another brother would move in. So they kept this rotation going. And lots of letters between the Frieders and the JDC and the REC stating that we could be bringing in thousands of more if we had the funding. And of course, it was always hard because they were funding places all over the world to help refugee Jews. And so as the funding came in, they'd be okaying more and more applications. And there were a lot of applications that were waiting to be filled but had to wait for the funds. So that's why it seems like the numbers were small. But it was a constant effort to bring in as many as they could support. Because you remember, this was a poor country. This was a very poor country. And President Quezon was insistent that they be able to work. Well, there's one story I didn't tell you, which I kind of have to tell you now. There was like 40 families that had kind of jumped ships in. They didn't come through the regular selection program. And they were very poor families, indigent, didn't speak English. And President Quezon donated his own land in Marikina. And they built kind of like 2 big dormitory type places. Well, they built a kibbutz in Manila, Marikina Hall. He donated his land for that. And then these families lived there in a kibbutz type fashion, farmed it, fed themselves, maintained themselves on this. And President Quezon was so impressed that he said, we can learn from the Jewish people about how to live off the land and take care of ourselves if we need to. So that was just an indication of the kind of man that President Quezon was. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that you had access to the National Archives. Is it here or archives in the Philippines?
Both. I was at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., actually in College Park, because the JDC, well, there was so much communication with State Department that there's a lot of State Department records on this. all of the lists that went from McNutt, copies that went to the State Department, all the list of the names, they're all there in State Department records. So there's not so many documents in the Philippine National Archives, because most of it was going through Paul McNutt's office. But you did have, of course, in Quezon's archives and Vargas's archives, a lot of the newspaper articles that were talking about refugees coming in. Quezon was giving all of these addresses and speeches in favor of helping the refugees, helping the displaced Jews of Europe. He was very adamant about it, especially after Kristallnacht. There was a big national push by him after Kristallnacht to make this happen. Any other questions? Yes?
What do you think happens to all of the non-German Jews in Manila with the occupation and when the battle for Manila took place? Do you think the Japanese killed them all?
Like the American Jews, the British Jews, the French Jews, they were interned.
Yes, but Japanese were ruthless, if you know about the Rape of Nanking.
Oh, it was brutal. It was awful. There was, and when the Japanese knew that they were being driven out of Manila, it was slash and burn. And there were atrocities committed that was witnessed by one of the German Jewish refugees that gave testimony at those trials against, the Japanese version of the Nuremberg trials. That gave witness to how they were lured into this Red Cross building and told that there was safety there, and then they were executed. And you could be just randomly punished for not bowing deep enough and beaten for that. But more so if you were Filipino than if you were a Westerner, because of that relationship. Japan and Germany wouldn't have been, Germany tried to influence the Japanese to build a ghetto in Manila. And the Japanese were like, we don't have time for your Nazi ways here. There wasn't a lot of respect between the Japanese and the Germans, obviously, but politically they had ambitions that they thought they could help each other with. But yeah, there was a push by the German leadership. The Nazi German leadership was there in the Philippines, and they tried to get them to build a ghetto and to put all of the Jews in it, but that didn't happen. Any other questions? Yes?
Did any of them end up on Mindanao where he wanted them to go?
Yes, there were some that actually made it on to Mindanao. Not very many. And then when the occupation happened, a lot of Jews just scattered from the cities and went out into the provinces to make their livelihood off the land. But there had been some who had actually made it to Mindanao. Well, they made it to the Philippines with the passport and the visa intended for this massive resettlement on Mindanao, but it didn't make it into real fruition. There was a gentleman who actually knew Cantor Sisner in Zabonchin, Poland, and he was welcomed at the pier by Cantor Sisner in Manila when he got there. But he wasn't there very long before the occupation happened, and he talks about how do I pretend that I'm a German Jew? I have a Polish passport. If they find out, they're gonna... So he reported himself. He was one of a selection of young men that had to build a new camp, El Baño, the Baños camp, which was more on the level of a concentration camp than the University of Santo Tomas was. Yes?
Was Manila considered, not Manila, Mindanao, a safe haven for everybody? The Japanese stayed away from Mindanao?
Mindanao was rural agricultural. It also had a pretty good population of Moros. Moros being Muslims. Muslims that had come from other nations. And so President Quezon was hoping that an influx of these very intelligent, hardworking, industrious Westerners would create kind of a barrier between the Moros and the Filipinos. Because the Filipinos were Christian. So we're talking about putting on Mindanao kind of a buffer of the Jewish community between the Muslim Moros and the Christian Filipinos. One big happy family.
Yeah.
So they didn't get along, the Muslims and the Christians didn't get along from the start?
I wouldn't say that. It was just a different culture, very different lifestyle. And that just made differences all around. But President Quezon tried very hard to bring the Moros populations into feeling that they were part of the country. Yes, we're all done.
We are done. I hate to say that. Let's follow Bonnie more often. I think she deserves an amazing round.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.